Welcome to Old Path and our Monday studies through the Old Testament. We are currently in the book of Ecclesiastes. We'll be in chapter 10 today, getting close to the close of this book. And we will have, of course, the Song of Solomon after this. And from that point on, we get into the prophets. And so I'm going to take a little bit of a different view on the minor prophets when we get there. Not even a view, the way I'm going to actually deal with them and the order of them when we get to it. And I'll explain that. It's going to be some time. I have to get through the four major prophets first, and that's going to take some time. So Isaiah and, of course, Jeremiah, then Ezekiel, before we get to Daniel, and then all the minor prophets. So it'll take us some time to get through all of that. There's a lot of content to get through. And again, the book of the Song of Solomon, I'll probably get through that relatively quickly compared to some of the other books based on the same kind of length, and I'll explain that when we get to it in a few weeks here. But chapter 10 in the book of Ecclesiastes, once again, there are some, I don't know if I want to call them repetitious things, though kind of like what it was with Proverbs in some ways. You will find some of the topics and some of the things are a bit repetitive. And so again, they all come from his observations over what I think is more of a lifetime than just a little bit of time that he dedicated to seeking those things out. I think this was a much more than just at the end of his life kind of a thing, though that would be when he would have recorded it and had it all written down. But I've mentioned that in the weeks previous. No sense in kind of rehashing that again. But chapter 10 has, again, some very, very interesting things to say, and but they do have a familiar ring to them. Now, real quickly, as we conclude today, I am going to be in the apologetic session of this. We live in a world where there are a lot of rivaling and competing belief systems that people have from a religious point of view. And as Christians, if we are asked to explain about these things, the Christian portion of what we believe is only part of it, because before there was Jesus, before he came into this existence, there always has been Jesus, the Son of God. He's always existed, but he took on a body of flesh and blood, like John tells us in the first chapter. But before that time, there was a lot about God's interaction with his people beginning at creation. And so we want to be able to, when we're talking with people, be able to speak about what it is that we believe as from the beginning of creation, a continuing work through of human history, all culminating in the time when Jesus came and lived among us, and then he died and resurrected. And from that point on, conquering of sin and death, what we have now in front of us is just kind of the expectation and the waiting for when the Lord will return. And then we start to get into the kingdom years and then the forever, the eternity of the new heavens and the new earth. But all of that is spelled out with such incredible specifics, because it is God who has written and spoken in times and had those things recorded. So really, ultimately, it hasn't been man who's been in control of conveying the belief. It's rather God speaking through the generations, and the way that he would do that in various different ways. Direct communication through prophets sometimes, angels at other times. There's just so many ways that God has communicated over time, and he's had a very consistent message from the very get-go, which makes the Bible, the belief in the God of the Bible, whether Jewish or Christian, unique and different from all other deities. So I want to kind of work through how that is, and basically just the big picture. And honestly, 100 people could come up with something like this, and it wouldn't look the exact same. These are just the big pieces that I picked out. If I'm talking with somebody about, well, why is it that you believe that you're right? Why is it that you believe that what yours is speaking is correct? Why should we believe what you believe when all these other religions say the same thing? Well, they don't say the same thing, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So we'll close with that. And very quickly, the Israel trip, I keep mentioning it, and I will only be able to do so for probably another couple of weeks, because the trip's going to get closed out here pretty quick. Of course, we have, in times past, we've had late additions to the trip. Problem is, there can be a further expense over what it would be today because they'll have to buy tickets closer to the trip. You can always get there, but the price would go up potentially based on airfare. So the actual cost of the trip is going to be the same, but the airfare will be what could potentially be a problem. As far as the safety aspect of it, none of that is really of concern to me. There is some news that Israel is going to be going back in, and that is to root out what's left of Hamas, and hopefully to be able to get to the hostages, and some of who we've seen in recent photographs and videos are being systematically starved. So Israel has really been left with no option other than to go back in and take over what is all of Gaza to bring this thing to a close. And so, once again, the quote world community and all the people who are supposed to be helping with the humanitarian things are failing everywhere because of Hamas. There's plenty of video to show that. But ultimately, that shouldn't have anything to do with our trip. And even if it did, it's all in the south. Hamas doesn't have the ability to do anything like it was even 6 months ago or a year ago. So it won't affect our trip. And there's nothing happening in the north anymore. That's back to being at normal pace. So honestly, if there's any reason why you have avoided this, other than maybe I can't afford it or whatever else, but if you have any other logistical things that are of concern, if you can put the time and you have the resource to do it, I wouldn't hesitate to go. I'm not concerned about going there in any way. We're making preparations for it. We're getting close. Starting to get very, very excited. We haven't been able to go there for a full year and a half. Because of all of what's been going on. But now that door is open to us, and we're very much looking forward to going. So Ecclesiastes chapter 10, let's go ahead and turn there. And we have just this chapter 10. We have 2 more chapters after that. At the latter part of chapter 12, we get his conclusion to this. And it's fascinating. After all the things that he has to say, you would think that there would be a very, very lengthy close to this. But he really is able to just kind of very briefly give a summation. What is the whole summary of all these 12 chapters? And he makes that very clear at the very end of it. You probably have already read ahead. But anyway, nonetheless, very, very interesting. If you're like if you were reading this for the very, very first time and you've read all the way through it and you get to those closing verses, you would go, you went through a lot of trouble to get to the point of just saying, after all of the frustration and futility and not even able to figure anything out, here's my conclusion, which we would want to lead with that. So anyhow, it will be interesting as we go ahead and close out the chapter. So having turned to Ecclesiastes 10, let's have a word of prayer and we'll take a look at the text. Father, we thank you once again for the privilege that it is to sit at your feet and to have you instruct us through your word, realizing that what we're reading is 3,000 years old, and it's written from a perspective of a man who knows the world in a much different way than we do, not just because of the grace that was shown to us through Jesus and the sacrifice that he made, but what you have revealed through the generations. So much more of the Bible written after Solomon's time than what was there before, and what you've revealed to us. All speaking about you by your nature and how you've communicated with your creation, and how grateful we are that you have. And so what we can learn and glean from Solomon, we pray that by your Spirit you would open our eyes of understanding and our hearts to be able to grasp these things and make proper application in our lives. And so we give you thanks and pray that you would have your way in the lives of all who hear your word, that we would be compliant to the things that we see, and that we would gladly just follow as you lead. We give you thanks and praise in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So Ecclesiastes 10 begins this way, and it's really kind of, once again, if we understand the actual language of it, sometimes it might sound a little bit different to us than what it looks like just in English. But if we knew what's really said, it even can sometimes give a little bit of a different look to it. So here's a great example of it. In the first one, it says, "Dead flies putrefy the perfumer's ointment, and causes it to give a foul odor, and so does a little folly to one respected for wisdom and honor." So really the second part of the verse is the key to this. So the idea that you can have a person who's really, really wise, but they get into some kind of folly, foolishness, just useless things, doing silly things that are of no use and no value, but they tarnish so much, even all of the wisdom. That's the concern that's here. So Solomon's looking for something that in a way of metaphor to say it's like this. And so what it is to the person who may have a lifetime of wisdom and known for such things, but a little bit of folly and compromise and foolishness and silliness, whatever you want to call it, can do so much damage. And, this is kind of just something that we know to be true, that you can undo, and this is with a Christian witness, and I tell this to people all the time, have done so in counseling and all the rest. It takes so little time to unwind so much time's worth of goodwill and of witness, if you will. People will not remember all of those things that you did really, really well, but they sure will remember the foolish thing that you did, and it can have such an effect of undoing so much of what God has done in your life. So there's a real importance to this all the way back to Solomon's time, though his world was different than ours when we think about Christian witness versus what he's talking about. This is just the person who is either seen or recognized as being wise, but to do the total opposite of wisdom is something that can very easily get the attention. And so what's the metaphor? What can we find that's something that's very similar to it in the world that we see around us? And he says this: it's like dead flies putrefy. It's the actual Hebrew on this is the deadly flies. And so there's a couple of different views on this. As these dead flies, you could think about an ointment or something that's a balm, but something that gives off a fragrance. And if a fly finds itself entrapped in it and it dies, all the decomposition and everything else will give off, it will spoil the smell. But it's really kind of weird, how many flies would have to be in the ointment for that to start to happen? We can get the understanding of rotting flesh, but we're talking about something the size of a fly. So if the direct Hebrew on this is of the type of a biting fly and what could end up happening as a result of something that has a poison to it and how it could corrupt flesh. But it's really it's hard to say exactly what type of a fly he's thinking about here, but that's not really the point. His point is that it will spoil. What will happen is that a fly, whether it's the stinging fly, the venomous, and makes kind of a grievous type of a sore, or if it's just an accumulation of these dead flies rotting in ointment, it just spoils what was purely something of a perfume of an ointment, and it's been spoiled, it's been made rancid by these flies. That's the point that he's getting to. So if we don't understand all of the thought process of what fly is he talking about and how would they corrupt it and how would they do this, you're missing the point. We're trying to get, at that point, too much detail into it. It's very simply put this way. It's no different than having flies spoiling something that is a fragrant perfume ointment. It's just as corrupting and detestable as somebody who has a life of wisdom and yet falls into some level of folly and the kind of corruption and damage that ends up doing. And that's really what he's kind of getting across here. We see it played out all the time. So again, the Christian witness, the application to this is, if you're somebody who's known for loving the Lord and being godly before him and walking honorably, how much of your witness can you undo by just allowing a little bit of compromise, a little bit of folly? That's the point that he's getting across here. So a wise man's heart is on his right hand, but a fool's heart is on his left. And of course, people love to try to make this about right versus left. And of course, Solomon's not thinking in the political sense. It's just kind of a funny little thing that you could say, yeah, see? Instead, what he's trying to show is that the opposites of things. So it's as far as the wise versus the fool, there is the person it's like having it in one hand versus the other. The two are never in the same place. It's really intended to show the contrast. So a man's heart is in his right hand, but a fool's heart. So the heart is really what controls and gives direction to the entirety of the being. So this is what's meant. Sometimes we would say the heart, the soul, whatever it is that makes you who you are. And so the heart of the fool as opposed to the heart of the wise. And in verse 3 it says, even when a fool walks along the way, he lacks wisdom, and he will show everyone that he is a fool. So even if they might be doing what would seemingly be kind of innocuous or even in the right way of things, the idea of traveling in the way, they're not they're not engaged in foolishness at the beginning of it, but they eventually make it to that place. And as he says here, the person that lacks wisdom shows everyone that he's ultimately a fool. Even if it looks like he's going along with the rest of everyone who has it all together, eventually this person, because it's in their nature to do so, they're going to follow after foolish things, and it's going to show. It's going to manifest itself in the demonstration of that foolishness, that folly. And it says, now, if the spirit of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your post, for conciliation pacifies great offenses. And this is very reminiscent to what we saw in chapter 8, verse 3. It's a very similar kind of a thing. It doesn't tell us how a ruler may see a person who's somehow fallen into disfavor. What's caused the disfavor? Is it something that was actually done or just perceived, or whatever the case may be? But if by chance the person finds themselves, and again, it's kind of more hypothetical, it's just down the road if you find yourself in this kind of a position. This is just giving counsel. Again, when it comes to Ecclesiastes, it's like this would be, if in that pursuit of wisdom, here is what I have noticed. If a ruler, somebody in a place of great authority, has a person as an object of their anger, of their wrath, of their fury, whatever it may be, the person that is having that put upon them, first of all, needs to qualify a couple of things. Am I guilty of what I'm being charged of doing, or have I been falsely accused? Now, if I just say I'm going to disconnect myself from this place, my position that I have here, my place, I'm going to vacate that to get away because of just either anger or looking at the person as being unjust, or for whatever reason, that ends up making a person probably look more like they're guilty. Rather, it would be better to just say in a conciliatory way, as Solomon would say here, don't go ahead and distance yourself from it, but find out what you can do in a conciliatory way to try to either, if you're going to exonerate yourself, you don't have to plead that right up front, let that come out. But it is one of those, don't leave your post, don't leave your position, your place, and then make whatever accusation seem more credible. But it's that kind of stand your ground, be conciliatory, find out if there's any way that you can reconcile this whole thing and let the truth come out ultimately. See, again, this is just kind of more practical kind of wisdom type things. It doesn't take into account who are the personalities, what's the circumstance. None of that stuff is spoken of. He's speaking very broadly, very generally here. And so the application to us, again, if somebody has a real problem with what we've done, it's easy to become argumentative or disassociate, remove yourself from whatever the situation is, rather than be conciliatory. Don't meet it in like manner, and then let the Lord be the one who vindicates you. So not hard, not an easy thing to do as far as our world is concerned. Kind of human nature doesn't really kind of work this way. We're always looking to, if we don't defend ourselves immediately, I'm not going to hang around for this. That's normally the way that we do it. Here Solomon would give the opposite counsel on that. Verse 5 says, now there is an evil that I have seen under the sun, as an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in great dignity, while the rich sit in a lowly place. And I have seen servants on horses, while princes walk on the ground like servants. So he's going to have a few places in this where he's going to begin looking at what he sees is just imbalance. The right people are not in the place where they ought to be, and the wrong people, they are in all of those places of authority. So he's speaking about these things in just again, a hypothetical way. These are things that he has recognized or noticed. And again, I think we talked about this maybe last week or the week before. When you think about Solomon, how big was his community, if you will? The people that he was around, what did he see? How far did he ever go away from Jerusalem? What places did he get to? Or was most of his interaction and dialogue with people who weren't from there, was it because they came to him? How much of a worldly understanding did he have? And again, it's going to be limited no matter what. This was not a world traveler. He was a king of Israel, and many did come to see him. We know that from reading through the Kings and Chronicles. We know that he was sought out because the message about who he was and the gift that God had given him for knowledge and wisdom had gone out far and wide, and people had come to know who he was. But again, even at that, people from the farthest reaches of what would be the known world who may have come to see him, is a small glimpse of what we can see on any given day, because we can know about things happening on the other side of the world almost instantaneous if we're actually looking at news or situation types of reporting on any particular thing anywhere in the world. Again, the news is instantaneous. Breaking news is genuinely breaking news, if depending on if you're kind of looking at that stuff from day to day. To him, much smaller kind of a situation. So again, is he saying this in the hypothetical, speaking about something that's an inevitability? How much of this did he absolutely observe? So again, however old he was, he's speaking about this as though these are things from his own observation. How much of the kings did he actually get a chance to see? David, of course, and then of course there's nobles and rulers and other people that are mentioned that would be in high places, as he mentions here. So let's look at this, because 5 through 7 is really kind of one thought. So there is an evil that I have seen under the sun, and again, the phrase under the sun is all the things that I can see in the observable world. And this idea of it's an evil, it's just that this is allowed to go on just as a demonstration of the bad, the ill, the evil, how it is in just the day-to-day life of humanity. It's just a reflection, whether he would say it this way or not, how we would look at it whenever we see something like this. There's inequality. It's not equitable. The people that should be in charge aren't, and the people who shouldn't be in charge are. It just seems like an evil, empty, useless, futile kind of a thing. We would look at it and say it's part of a fallen creation, but help is on the way, if you will, because the Lord will judge it and rule it in righteousness. And that seems to be getting closer every single day. But to Solomon, he just says it's an evil, and I see it, and it just, you can see it frustrates him. And it should frustrate anybody, because it just doesn't seem right. It's out of balance. So he says, it's just like an arrow that proceeds from the ruler. Folly is set with great dignity, while the rich sit in the lowly place. So folly is that place. It's not a dignified thing, but it's sitting in the seat of what would be considered a dignified thing. So he's thinking rulers. So the people that are in authority, the people making the decisions, the people who should be seeing for the well-being of the people, all the things that you would think nobility is supposed to be about. You would have a king because it's somebody that you could look at and you could say they have our interest in mind. And with David, somebody who hears the voice of God and is sensitive to those things, even with all of his failings, his desire was to be right before God, right before the people, and lead them in a way that was right and good and honorable as far as God is concerned. So that kind of a person ought to be the one if there's going to be some kind of human rulership. But here Solomon says it's the opposite. So the people who are the fools are in these places that should be reserved for the dignified, the decent people. And then he mentions here the rich, and don't think in just common rich terms. So riches and having great wealth and great possessions is really nothing that you can say is good or bad. It's a neutral thing. Because in our world, I find people with great amounts of wealth who are just wonderful people. And there are people who are fabulously wealthy who are the most corrosive and awful people that you could imagine. So the wealth is really just kind of a neutral thing. It just depends on who has it and what do they do with it. So his point would be the same thing. This riches could be riches of wisdom, riches of goodness, riches of mercy. They have a wealth of those things over and above anything that's material. But those people should be the ones occupying the dignified place, yet they are in the place of the lowly. And he says, folly is set in great dignity, while the rich sit in the low place. And he says in verse 7, I have seen servants on horses while princes walk on the ground like servants. So again, that idea, the person who should occupy a place is actually having that place occupied by someone who is the complete opposite of them. So the person who should be in the lesser place is in the greater, and the person who should be in the greater is in the lesser. He gives a couple of examples there in verses 6 and 7. So again, we see it all the time in our world today, and that just helps us to understand from his observation of 3,000 years ago to our observation of today, different time, different place, different country, different everything that we could imagine, but the human condition is still very consistent. It's still the same way that we see it today. Again, there was a time, and if I use our country, there was a time when our leaders were people that we could look up to and think, when you read their writings, especially I'm thinking of the first generation, the first maybe couple, 3 generations of leadership that we saw in our country, there were some very godly people who cared deeply about doing the right thing. And even if it came at great expense to them, they were willing to do it because it was such an important thing. Now you look at most of the people who are in places of power, and they're pretty contemptible people. And they do some really awful, wicked things, which we would expect of unregenerate people. But the people who really have no business being in those positions, those are the ones who seem to have the most power and do the most corrosive things, but there's never accountability. So I get his frustration. We see it around us all the time. In verse 8 it says, "Now he who digs a pit will fall into it, and whoever breaks through a wall will be bitten by a serpent. He who quarries stones will be hurt by them, and he who splits wood may be endangered by it." And this is kind of just a way of saying a person who has all manner of ability, and they're the right person at the right time for the right thing. They have these particular skills, and yet those same skills will not be able to save them if calamity comes. So of the examples that he gives here, the person who digs a pit, they never have any intention. It's like when they're digging the pit, they're digging it for something to fall into it, never expecting it to be themselves. Or the person who breaks through a wall, bitten by a serpent. Not what you'd expect once you breach that wall. And there's a not necessarily consensus on who the wall breakers are and what's the reason for them breaking through a wall, but it would sound just like the person that's the conqueror. If they're able to break through a wall, the last thing you would expect is to be bitten by a snake. You're expecting to encounter the people on the other side of the wall. Instead, it's a snake and you're bitten. So he's giving a number of different examples of very, very real life kinds of situations that a person may find themselves in and not expecting what is the ultimate outcome of it. So it says, "Now he who quarries stones may be hurt by them," because you can be damaged by the stones that you're quarrying, and and he who splits wood may be endangered by it. So we get that cutting down of trees and the things that happen. In California, I can tell you this, in all the years that we lived there, and the house that we had, our last one that we lived in, had a fireplace, and I don't know if we had it on 10 times in the 11 years that we lived there. And in the 15 or so years in the house before that, there was a fireplace there. We never lit a fire. It just never happened. It was Southern California. You don't mess with those things. Out here, different story altogether. The winter times, we love to have fires because it gets cold here, but we split our own wood. We'll have to split it, chop it, cut it down, do all that stuff. It's something that I had never done in all my life until we got here. And then every winter for several months, we love to have fires when it gets really, really cold. But you go through a lot of time doing it, and I could see where people could get hurt very seriously. It's not funny, but I could see where mistakes could be made and somebody could actually become hurt by just what is to them a routine thing. So you get the point. You see where he's going with this. So then this last part, which is really, really cool, it says, "Now if the axe is dull and one does not sharpen the edge, then he must use more strength." Now we get that. But it says, but wisdom brings success. So the point that's being made here, if it's not obvious, it's like, okay, an axe is intended to be very, very sharp, that when it's better to just take as few swings with it as possible, which really requires a good sharp edge. So if it starts to dull down, you have one of two options. The foolish thing to do is I'll just have to swing harder and I'll have to have more wax at it. Or the wise person would say, it's not sharp anymore. How about I just sharpen this thing and it'll make the task that much easier. You can see the difference in the way that people attempt to remedy, if you will, a situation. So this is again the application of the person who does wisely as opposed to the person who does not do wisely. So in verse 11, "A serpent may bite when it is not charmed. The babbler is no different." And so again, to us, here in this part of the world, in the West, we don't think of snake charmers, but we've seen all the, of course, when we're kids, it's in cartoons. But if you've ever watched it, there are these people who actually will play music and they'll do things with hand motions and whatnot, and they'll kind of mesmerize even snakes to where they're not as quite aggressive. You're not in the same kind of danger because they've been really kind of satiated. They've been really kind of made very calm, and in this case, this means it's been charmed or enchanted. That's the language that's being used here. It doesn't mean that it's got any kind of a spell, but it's the actual literal way of saying it is the whisperers, a person that whispers. So the enchanter would be one who whispers. And so it's given that kind of view of, well, this must be speaking of some kind of mystical way of doing it. But if you watch the people, they'll do stuff with either hand motions or music, playing some kind of a thing, but it just mesmerizes the snake. Those are far less inclined to strike than the ones that are agitated. When you walk up on them, you're going to get bit. So this is the point that he's saying. A serpent may bite when it is not charmed. If you just catch it and you surprise it and it lashes out, same thing. The babbler is no different. So he uses a lot of these same terms. Babbler, the fool, there's a number of different examples that he's given. It is basically the same thing. It's intended to be very, very general. So a person that is given to babbling, and just that means just rambling incessantly with making no sense. A person that's a fool or into folly, he can use these interchangeably. The point is, they may strike without notice because there's just nothing that's calmed them down. They're just reactionary. And so he says, those same kind of people, we all recognize them. The words of a wise man are gracious. A wise man's mouth are gracious, but the lips of a fool shall swallow him up. Now, there's a way that this is looked at. Now, first of all, the person who's speaking, is the person speaking damaging themselves, or are they damaging someone else? When you put these two sentences together, or the bookends of it, it's really about how a person speaks and the effect that it could have on the other person that's being spoken to. So in this case, the words of a wise man's mouth are gracious, and that's outwardly. Now, again, we can look at this in as broad terms as we want to, but if we look at it in the direct context of this, the words that come from a person's mouth are going to have an effect on the person that's there. So the idea of having gracious words, it really ought to be in every discourse that we have. That should be the way that a Christian's life is, that they're to be gracious words. Again, we get that repeated to us when we read Ephesians chapter 4, that Paul talks about, don't let any corrupt words escape from your mouth, except that which imparts grace to the hearer, and it's edifying. So it builds up the person, and it shows to them grace. So let those be the ones. Don't let things that are corrupt come out. Say those things only that are gracious, because they'll have the effect, as Paul wants to see, of unity and of real calm and peace in the church, as opposed to some of the things that he hints at. There was some dissension and trouble potentially in that church, and he's calling them away from those things. Solomon's onto the same thing that's here. A person, by the things that they say, can have a gracious effect, and it will be helpful and edifying, building up to the person who hears it, as opposed to the lips of a fool will swallow him up. The him is the question. Will his words swallow himself up and cause damage to him? Or is it more looking at the wise person? If you're looking at these people as the participants in a conversation, the wise person is going to do what they can to speak graciousness to the person, and it's a very diffusing kind of a thing. The fool is going to say anything he can say, and it's going to do harm to the person who's tried to be gracious. That's one way that this could be seen. You can make the case for it biblically. Either one of these works as far as what we see in other places in the Scripture. Solomon's intent is somewhat disputed here, depending on who you're reading on this, but you can understand that the point would be the person who's speaking can either have this effect on himself by his speaking things that will have an effect to him and on others. It's across the board, as opposed to the fool. Not only will his words harm someone else, but they could ultimately be harmful to him as well. So you can make the case, like I say, for either one. It works either way. Verse 13, it says, now the words of his mouth begin with foolishness, and the end of his talk is raving madness. And I love the raving madness. It's unstable and insane. So again, it's contrasted by what we see in the first part of this. The words of his mouth begin with foolishness. So this is speaking of the guy who speaks foolishness and to the ruin of the person that's either the object of their wrath, or of speaking of themselves, they bring trouble on themselves, because it goes on further to explain that the words begin, it starts with foolishness, it starts poorly. But it gets to the point, by the time that they're done, it's unstable. It's like mental. It's frenzied. It's insane. So, unfortunately, I find this so often with people who are just so convinced that everything that you see, and this is Christians who do this, everything that you see in the world around you has some kind of nefarious, backroom deal kind of making type of thing. Everything is a conspiracy. And I just find sometimes those people, the things that they say and their conclusions are they're just ranting. They're not even sane. But anyhow, some people would say the same of me, and I'll sleep well tonight. Verse 14, a fool also multiplies words. No man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him? So the person just speaks so much of everything, and there's no real concise way of trying to say things. They just kind of cloud the whole issue with just a bunch of words. You can't convince them of anything after them. They're just so stuck in their own little world of all of the things that they're constantly saying. Again, this is all in the context of what we looked at in the last few verses. The person that is destructive with their words, they lead themselves to madness, and even creating it in other people, just that tension that comes from them, and they just keep piling it on. There's no letting up in them. It increases, going more and more and more, and you can't even get them back to reality. They just continue down that road. And then verse 15, the labor of fools wearies them, for they do not even know how to go to the city. And again, this is all in the same context. Verses 11 through 15 is one paragraph, and this is kind of the last part of it. So they become so consumed by all of their foolish endeavors and all of the things that drive them to the point of that raving madness that's going on, to the point where they can't even function as a normal person. They can't even find themselves, they can't even look at a road leading to a city. They're just that detached from reality. And it's hard for us to even wrap our minds around that, because he's just speaking about foolish people like this. We have met people with all kinds of, mental disease who just don't know what end is up. And I don't think this is kind of where Solomon's going with this. His point is, this is a folly that they have chosen. Their actions and the things that they do, it leads to an increasing kind of insanity and a disconnection from reality. But ultimately, they get to the point, as he puts here, for they don't even know how to go to the city. That's the labor. What's the yield of all of what they've done? What's the produce after this whole time that whatever it may be? But the life of a fool is so consumed with all the useless, silly things, they don't even know how to function, like getting out of their home and finding their way into a city. They're that out of it. So, verse 16, this is a really interesting one. There is the blessing and the woe. And this is something that we will see in the New Testament quite a bit. Even thinking about the words that Jesus speaks right now on Thursdays, we're going through the book of Matthew, and there are a number of places, we're looking at it in the 5th chapter, not just in there, but in other places where the word blessed is used. And in this case, in the Beatitudes, it's blessed are those, and he gives a whole list of these people. But the blessing is more than just, you look at those people and, oh, they're blessed, they're happy. Well, they're happy and they're blessed for a number of reasons. And one is not just because they're walking in favor, but when you read those things, there are some of the parts of the blessings, if you will, that really kind of imply maybe some real difficulty. And so the point would be, if they can be blessed and happy through that, it's because God is the one who has alerted them to it. He's the one who stands with them even in those times of trouble. The people who go through all those things know that there is an end to all of those things, that he will be with them. He's the one who endows them. He's the one who gives them the awareness of it, but also how he will be there with them in it, and how ultimately they will be the beneficiaries of all of those blessings that are put there. Some of them are really, really favorable, and you look at them and there's no turmoil in the person. At other times, there are some that imply turmoil. Persecution is one of those, and the idea of being hated. There are some of them that are, mourning is the second of them, and so some of those imply that time of difficulty and time of trouble, and yet being blessed because God has not only made you aware of it, but lets you know that this is not the end of it. It's not whatever the trouble may be is not the last of things. So very, very important that we fully grasp what's being explained here. So he says here, "Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child and your princes feast in the morning. But, by contrast, blessed are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobles and your princes feast at the proper time for strength and not for drunkenness." Now, this is just kind of one of those things going back to the observable things that Solomon would have understood. There's a time when you start to think about kings and nobles and people in places of authority. They ought to be, especially if you're talking about the king of Israel. If you're talking about the king of Israel at the time, then the assumption should be, as the king over the tribes of Israel, of the people of God, that person should be impeccable when it comes to matters of spirituality and maturity and doing all of the right things. They should not be like the worldly. They should not be like the ones who pursue after wickedness. And again, they should not be like children in their thought process. They should be very sober-minded, and all of those things should be in place. So that would be, again, that's the idealistic view of this. Is that really the history of the kings? Well, clearly not. And even by this time, Saul would not have fit those qualifications. David would, for the most part, have filled those qualities quite well. At times, Solomon did as well, but we know that he had those times of real waywardness, and his wives turned his heart from the Lord. But as you look through the kings, by the time that Solomon is off of the scene, and after he dies, then there's a split in the nation, and it's now divided. Instead of being Israel, it's now Israel and Judah. And two tribes go together, Benjamin and Judah in the south. All the other tribes, though Simeon is pretty far in the south and actually surrounded by the tribal allotment to Judah, Simeon, the tribe, sides with the northern tribes. So it splits into a 10 and 2. Levites are not mentioned as being, one way or the other. They're serving all the people. So the split that happens after this, the northern kings, starting with Jeroboam, are just all varying degrees of horrible, awful people. When you get to the kings of the south in Judah, some were good and some were really, really bad. Following what Solomon is saying here, he couldn't have understood what was going to happen after him. So what he puts in place is, again, the ideal. So if you're saying, look, we don't want a kid being the king, we don't want them having no idea of what it is to be in that place of importance, because they're going to make all kinds of just bad decisions. And so that would be a woeful thing. You don't want somebody who's not up to the task. But blessed is a nation, O nation, if the people that are leading you know their part and they're faithful to it and they execute those kind of judgments. Now, interestingly enough, it is a very, very interesting thing when you find that there's one that comes to mind. When I read this, he comes to mind instantly, and that is King Josiah, because he is the complete opposite of everything that is said here. Josiah was 8 years old when he became the king. So let's read these texts here again with all of that in mind, because it's a pretty interesting thing when you stop to consider kind of who it was that he was following after. I mean, Manasseh is his grandfather, and is about as awful can get. His father was Ammon. Manasseh was 56 years. I think he was the longest reigning king. After him, his son Ammon reigned for 2 years and was killed by his servants. And both of these were incredibly wicked men. You would think, as Josiah comes into being the king at 8 years old, how much worse could it be? Your father and your grandfather were wretched, horrible, wicked, abominable people. Now here's a kid with having that as his own, the only thing that he has as looking at other kings, and you would figure he's got every strike against him. Hardly. When you look at that young man's life and what he ends up doing in his time as king, it is nothing short of magnificent what happens under Josiah's reign. So obviously there are people around him. At 8 years old, you're not making decisions as a king. You don't even understand the world as it should be. And this is what Solomon's concern is. If you have a boy king, they don't know how the world works. So what God did is, obviously, he raised up people around Josiah who honored God, and they raised him up that way. But the disrepair that happened in the nation by the time he takes over is almost unimaginable when you go back and read his story. And if you are not familiar with Josiah, I strongly encourage you, go back and read that young man's whole of history. Read all the accounts of his life, not only in Chronicles, but also in Kings. And you'll get a chance to see what an amazing, amazing young man this was. Actually, he's just kind of, to me, he's a hero of the Old Testament that doesn't get a lot of press, not anywhere near what he should. Fascinating, fascinating guy. So when we see this, woe to you, O land, when your king is a child and your princes feast in the morning. And that feast in the morning isn't just they're such young kids that all they think about is breakfast and cereal. That's not the point. It's at inappropriate times that there's the feasting, there's the drinking and all the celebratory things, and not even understanding the gravity and the magnitude of your job. And so at this point, it's like, nation, what a horrible thing it's going to be. Woe is alas. It's an interjection in the type of the part of speech that it is. It's like that, I can only think of the Schoolhouse Rock when I was a kid. Interjections are those things about excitement or emotion. You hit your hammer, or you hit your finger with a hammer, and it's ouch. It's that exclamation that happens out of nowhere. In this case, it's a thoughtful thing, woe, but it's still an interjection. It's just what a woeful, what a horrible thing is, what a detestable, difficult thing this is. If a nation is run by a child who only knows, and the child doesn't mean it has to be an infant or a little kid, they conduct themselves as a child. They're impulsive, impetuous. They'll get up in the morning and they'll start their celebratory things at totally inappropriate times. But by contrast, blessed, happy, content, people who have a reason for celebration. Blessed are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobles. And just the idea of son of nobles is not necessarily any kind of a guarantee of a good outcome. Because again, if we think about just the people right before what we saw with Josiah, from Manasseh, his grandfather, to his father, they were nobles. But they would be what we would consider as ignoble. They're the opposite of what would be nobility and good and wholesome and all the rest of it. They were the opposite of that. So the idea of nobles is really kind of using them as an example of what should be, but all too often was not. And again, Solomon's saying this is the third in the line of kings, and there were many to follow him, that it seems like the further that they went in time, the worse things got. So, blessed are you as a nation when your king is the son of nobles and your princes feast at the proper time, when it's appropriate, when it's useful. And it says, for strength and not for drunkenness. It's because these are people who need to be fit and ready to do and exercise their duties. Not that they eat just because it's party time, but it's because this is what's necessary for us to stay functional. That's what their feasting and everything else, or their food, the intake, is really for sustaining themselves to be prepared for their positions. So verse 18 says, now because of laziness the buildings decay, and through idleness of hands the house leaks. A feast is made for laughter, and wine makes merry, but money answers everything, which is, at first blush, not necessarily all that easy to understand. But let's read verses 18 and 19 together. Because of laziness the house decays, and through idleness the hands lack. Idleness of the hands, the house leaks. A feast is made for laughter, and wine makes for merry. These are all the things that people can be pursuing after, especially in verse 19, the things of making merry, of all of it. But you only do those things because you have the means with which to do it. When it comes to the house and the falling into disrepair, it's not for lack of funding. It's because of the condition of the heart that causes it. And here he says, and yet if they would only understand that the resource that is available to them is something that should be used for the right reasons. As he puts here, money answers everything. It is really what gives the ability for all of those things, especially the second part, which is the making of merry and all the rest of it. If you're going to spend all of your time doing that kind of stuff, that goes along with the laziness and all the rest of it. Yeah, it provides you the ability to do it, but you're going to blow through it pretty quick. You're just going to waste it. So verse 20 then ends up saying this: now do not curse the king even in your thought, and do not curse the rich even in your bedroom. Now, if that was the only thing that was said there, then it would basically be, don't do this because this is the right way that you should conduct yourself. Don't speak evil of those people in places of authority, whether the king or, in this case, the rich, the nobles, kind of that type of thing, the people that are in places of great authority. It's the prohibition, or what he's saying, don't do it, isn't because of who these people are necessarily. It's because they might find out about it. That's an interesting way that he says this. It's not, again, at the end of it, because that's not the right course of action. It's like, if you're going to be vocal about this stuff, and even if you're just thinking about it, sooner or later you're going to end up saying it. And then the second part of it, here's the problem: for a bird of the air may carry your voice, and a bird of flight may tell the matter. Sooner or later it's going to get out, and it's going to get back to that person. And he doesn't elaborate further on it in this particular proverb, or this particular chapter of Ecclesiastes. But it's just kind of one of those things. Yeah, be careful what you say or even what you think. And if it gets verbalized, just know sooner or later that's going to get back to the source, or not to the source, but to the person that you're speaking evil of. So again, this would be a great thing if we could ever get to the place where we were careful about saying what we say about the person, not because of fear of what would happen, but because, is it the right way of doing it? Now, again, I have no problems if we're going to go ahead and speak about a person who is purposefully, or even maybe even unaware, but passing along bad information. I think of this on the pastoral side. When I know that there are things that are being taught that are so unbiblical, I'm passionate about that, and I don't mind if I say it, and if it gets back to one of the people, and I'm not usually saying it about the person sitting next to me, because I'm not worried about what they're doing. We're all sitting in the same church. It's when I see very prominent leaders speaking things and teaching things biblically that are unbiblical, or speaking about things in the Bible as though they're true, but they're actually not. And if we're going to call those people out, which we should, if it gets back to them, great. They can let me know if they've got a problem with what's been said, but I'm just going to still point out that, yeah, but this is what you've said. This is what you're teaching. But in this case here, it's really kind of said this way because that king or that person that you're speaking about may have the ability to end up doing something to you that would be to your harm. So be careful, keep it to yourself, is kind of what he's saying here. That's why it's not really intended to be kind of a prohibition about speaking our mind about something. In this case, if your criticism is of a person who can do harm to you, be really careful about verbalizing that, because that stuff could come back on you. So again, he's not trying to teach a spiritual matter. He's teaching more about a practical one. But be careful what you say, because that stuff could come back to get you, and you can't undo what you may have said. So really kind of an interesting way that he concludes this particular chapter. But again, we've watched most all of these things. We can see, and they're in the observable world around us. As it was for him, so it is for us as well. We see those things. So we're going to pick up at chapter 11 next week, maybe even getting chapter 12. We might do the two of them together. Chapter 11 is kind of a short chapter, but we'll see. And we'll either conclude the whole of the book next week, or potentially the week after, and then we'll get into the Song of Solomon. So the last of the writings of Solomon after Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. Now, as I had mentioned at the beginning of the study, I think it's really a very important thing for us to do when we try to describe what it is that we actually believe as Christians in a world where there are a lot of rivaling beliefs, spiritually speaking. And I even want to direct this at what I would consider as the pseudo-Christian cults, as like with Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses. I would put them in the same category as this, because they really do rewrite even the very nature of God himself, whether it's God the Father or Jesus the Son. In the case of the Mormons, both the Father and the Son are at one point very much different than who they are now. So that they really do damage, they do harm to the actual truth of the Scripture. And so they can call themselves Christians, but what they teach is not Christian. They're not. People may hear this and think that I'm being mean about the whole thing. I do not consider them to be brothers and sisters in the Lord. I don't care if they call themselves Christians. I don't care if they'll quote the Bible. I don't care about any of that stuff. When they get to the very essence of who God is by his nature, they teach something different about who he is at his core, at his very essence. And if that's the case, then we're not talking about the same God here. We're talking about a repackaged counterfeit that sounds a lot like him until you peel back a few layers of the onion and you find out we're not talking apples and apples here. So it's with that in mind that I want to be very, very careful to distinguish who we're talking about here. So us as believers in the biblical version of who God is, and not some pseudo-Christian cult, and then all the other belief systems that there are out there. What you'll find is if you were to ask somebody who believes something in a spiritual sense. Now, I'm not talking about the atheist. I'm not talking about the secular humanist, those kind of people. They're a-religious when it comes to this. But people who may say, well, I believe in a spirituality, or I believe in this particular religion, something like that. Ask them to start working through tell me about origins. Tell me about how everything started. How has God communicated to you through the ages? What is the ultimate goal? What's the relationship that man has with God? How do you know where you are in your standing with him? What's happened next? And, how do you get to heaven? And is there such a thing as an eternity as far as what you believe spiritually speaking? And you're going to find that if people really do know all of those answers and have a good source for it, most of the time it's going to be more because that's what they've heard, but not because their scriptures actually say that stuff directly. Many of the different religions are very much either philosophical. The New Age beliefs, the Eastern religions are very much that way when it comes to Islam. And when you start to read what is said there, it's quite political and it's quite warlike in a number of different ways. But there's not a lot of direct connection from the God who is speaking to the individual, and there's not much of a back and forth to that. There's not the idea of expressing love for his creation on an individual level to the point of even willing to sacrifice themselves. Himself. Those things, just what I've talked about, are pretty much unique to the God of Scripture. So let's just, if we could, let's do some big picture parts of this. When we look at the Bible in the way that it's laid out, it really is very much a continuing narrative, if you would. So what we're given in Genesis, and this is supposed to be, it's the beginning. It's where it all started, and we get a breakdown. Remember that it's being written by Moses probably 25 years in round figures, about 25 years after the actual creation itself had taken place. I am a biblical creationist. I believe that the earth was created in just thousands of years back. I know people love to just mock that. I don't care. I'm good with it. But I have reasons for believing it as well. So, those are reasons that I could give if anybody had any question. But we have a perfect creation that God makes, and we get that from everything that we have written. God is looking at his creation and said, it is very good. It's perfect. It's exactly the way that it's supposed to be. So it was perfect in its creation, and then at God's direction, he gives, if you will, instruction to Adam and Eve. Here's what I expect of you, which they pretty much didn't have much in the way of any kind of prohibitions. It's just don't partake of the fruit of that tree. And there's a spiritual aspect to the fruits and the tree and all the rest of that it's there kind of implied, but it's the knowledge. It's to know what is good and evil. It's the idea of knowing these things. You're completely innocent, which that tells us that God created man, and they're not fallen at that point. They are pure, and as far as God is concerned, they don't have an understanding of good and evil. So they're just very innocent as far as that's concerned. But God tells them, don't do this. And then they do immediately thereafter, they disobey that, and that sin is introduced at that point. Because of sin, death enters in, and they're separated and locked out of what God had given to them, because now they know the difference from right and wrong. And as a result of that, of course, now we have a fallen and a broken creation. If we read what the Bible has to say about that, before that there wasn't death. So again, we know that even as far as the animals were concerned, they weren't killing one another because death had not entered in. All of that happened as a result of sin. That's what the Bible teaches. It's not me just trying to read into the narrative. We have that on in multiple places where we understand that corruption brought about death. And yeah, all of the creation began to rebel against itself and against one another. So man is then at that point, we're shown that he's dead in his sin and trespass, and there's really nothing that can be done about it. Man is now separated from God. Sin is a barrier, and there's nothing that can be done about that. And then we get the idea that man's sin and his rebellion against God had become so great that we get the story of what taken. I shouldn't say story. Story means that it can be just something that's fabricated or made up. I don't believe that to be the case. I believe what we read about the flood is a literal account of what took place. And I see the world around us where we look at the sedimentary layers that are laid down and some other very interesting things that happen that really do fit the biblical narrative of, as the land masses begin to move, you find rock structures of sedimentary rock that have these incredible waves. Some of them are, like 60, 70 feet tall, where everything was compressed while it was still wet. If we believe the evolutionists, they'll tell you that many layers of strata, they develop over millions of years. Well, millions of years turns it into rock, and it doesn't bend, it breaks. These are clearly bent, they're compressed together. So anyhow, there's the biblical explanation of what happened with the flood. And of course, God preserves 8 men alive, 8 men and women alive out of all of the creation, and the kind of the proto-animals that would have been there that could have created everything that you see here in our world, all the variations of particular varieties of dogs and cats and horses and whatever you want to see. They all they have a common ancestor as far as that's concerned. Proto-mutt, if you will. That's where the DNA is. So it's the important part of that is that we get that God says, I'm not always going to strive with man. When we read Genesis, the days of his existence on this earth are numbered because their rebellion is so bad that it tells us that the thoughts, everything about their thought and their thought process was evil continually. That's what the Bible says about it, which is just pretty corrosive and pretty corrupt. So we have that. There is that man is broken, and sin, even after the flood, sin is still not something that can be fixed, but not all is lost. That's the good news. We get to that point where then Abraham becomes this referred to as the friend of God. God says to him, and again, remember, by this time, there's 2,000 years since the creation. Man's been on the planet. That stuff has been going on. By that time, idolatry and all the rest of it was rampant, and so all the rebellion against God was already taking place yet again. When God comes to Abram, he's in Ur of the Chaldees. His father was an idol merchant. He would sell idols for the things that people would worship. God comes to him and says, I want to lead you to a land that I'll show you. And basically it's a matter, do you trust me? The Bible tells us that Abraham heard him and believed it. Chapter 15 says that he believed that God said what he would do. He believed in that promise that God had given, and it says that God accounted it to him as a righteous act. God approved of Abraham because God made the offer. Abraham accepted the offer and trusted that God would make good on his promise. You have 500 years that goes on, and again, sin is an issue, never has changed, but Abraham walked with God by faith. That's what we know. So we get that from not only what else did he have. There's nothing written down and codified that we know of. That happened with Moses 500 years down the road. So then God says, here's my law. This is what I expect. This is what you can and cannot do. And it would tell you to not do this or to do these things that God says not to do, or not to do the things that he says. That's sin. And sin carries with it a price, a consequence. And the wages of sin is death, as Paul would tell us. And so the law identified sin, but also gave the remedy. And the sad news is that something that was innocent was going to have to die for the guilty. And that was really setting the table for the person of Jesus Christ, who comes into this world as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, was given as an offering for all of mankind at Pentecost, the Lamb of God that was offered. And through him, we have the forgiveness of sin by his blood to those who will accept that offer. And by resurrecting from the dead, he conquers death, giving life to us, the promise of eternal life. If he can conquer death for himself, he can conquer death for all of us as well. So from that point, as he comes into this creation, sin is still an issue, but sin now has a perfect champion, if you will, one who has defeated the consequence of sin. And he has given himself as that ransom that we had all accumulated by our sin that was going to be against our account that we couldn't pay. He's done all those things for us. And then reconciled us to God, defeated death in the process by resurrecting from the dead. Now we have the hope of eternity, which is wonderful because that tells us all the rest of the things that we know. Our future is not something that is really left in doubt. Now, other religions will tell you that they have a belief in what is the hereafter, but most of actually all of them are going to be based upon the person and their own merit, the things that they will do that will qualify them for a life of eternity in something that they would consider as a favorable outcome. But it's all based upon them. They have to do it by their own actions. Some of them will give the provision that you might have to do it through an innumerable amount of lifetimes till you get to the place of perfection. But ultimately, your eternity is going to be based upon your own actions and whether or not you measure up to some standard. The Bible would tell us that there's no such standard. You cannot possibly measure up to it, or else then you could end up earning your way to heaven. We're told in no uncertain terms what heaven is going to be like, and what it is that will happen in succession. We've recently concluded a study through the book of Revelation that tells us all of those things. There's a time that's coming to this world where judgment is coming. At the end of that, Jesus will return and establish a kingdom that will last 1,000 years, and then will usher in what is the eternity, the new heavens and the new earth, an eternal city with no corruption. So that's what the Bible tells us, and it gives all of that detail, not just in a sentence here or a sentence there. But remember, there's 66 books in the Old and New Testament combined, and they cover all of that stuff that I've been saying. And everything that you will read kind of fits in that progression of things that took place. That's unique. And so, again, it's good for us to have a good operational knowledge of how things started and how they will conclude. We want to be able to say that and do it as a way of saying by comparison. It's not to argue that I'm right, you're wrong. I usually like to start with, if I get a chance to do something like what I'm talking about here, I want to hear their side of it first, so that they're not hearing me saying, here's what I believe and everything else is wrong. I want to say, what is it that you believe? Where did you come from? How were things created? Is man responsible before God? Is God personal as far as you believe in who he is? And I want to ask all of those kinds of questions in the hopes that they have to think through what it is that they believe. And if they do, then praying that God gives me an open door to say, can I compare notes with you about what it is that you believe versus what I do? I'd love to try to see if we can reconcile this some way. Now, I know that there's no way to reconcile other religions with the God of the Bible. There's just no way. I would rather show them as being in two contrary places, and there's no way to make them compatible, but many people try to do that. I remember hearing from someone very close to me years and years ago that all roads lead to God, and this person even said, well, Jesus and Buddha were brothers. It's like, where on earth did you hear that? That's just the most nonsensical thing that you could ever imagine. But more importantly than that, this idea that all roads lead to God, the Bible would tell you that that is the case, because everybody will stand before him at some point, but they make it seem as though everybody's going to wind up in heaven, whatever their concept of heaven is, because God's a God of love and everything will be just fine. We're good people. Many religions would teach some variation of that. The Bible teaches the total opposite of that. Man is broken in his sin and cannot repair it. He needs someone to remedy the problem. And in us, with what we believe, that is precisely what Jesus did by offering himself on a cross for the sin of mankind. And so people are free to believe that or not believe it. That's not the issue. It's just making sure that we're clear on what it is that we believe and being able to support it, scripturally speaking. Here is the progression of time for the last 6,000 years. This is what has taken place, and here's where we are currently. Here's what's still left unresolved. Being gathered to him, the time of tribulation that's coming upon the earth, which everything you can point to, so many different things that are really pointing us in the direction that that's not too far down the road, and that here's what will happen after that begins to take place. We're given the sequence of events. So knowing all of those things and being able to articulate those are very, very important to us as believers to an unbelieving world. So hope that helps and hope that that's useful. If you have any questions on any of the things that we've looked at today, if you'd like information on the Israel trip, please do contact us through the ministry's website, which is oldpaththeology.net. And I would love to answer any questions that you have about any of those topics. And so we will pick up at chapter 11 in Ecclesiastes next Monday. Join us on Thursday as we study through the Beatitudes, and the Sermon on the Mount will be in that for several weeks, maybe more. We'll be in it for a little while. It's 3 chapters in Matthew that are very, very instrumental in the basics of Christianity, and it's really, really good content, very, very useful to us. So again, we'll pick up next Monday here in Ecclesiastes 11.